Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Madness and Grace podcast. Just me and Matt again here today. And today we're going to be covering a topic that's unfortunately really prominent in today's news. We're going to be talking about, violence, in particular mass shootings in relation to mental illness. But before we get started, Matt, how's it going? How are you doing?
It's going all right. I was excited about talking about this, not because I particularly like to talk about this, but just because it's such a hot topic and, everybody is talking about it. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of misunderstandings of what these are. There's a lot of, kind of apples and oranges comparison because, one mass shooting or mass attack is not necessarily the same as another one or necessarily even related, just depending on what the event was, where it was, who it was, those types of things. So I thought I'd kick us off today by asking you a question, which we don't do nearly enough. And, as a young 20-something-year-old woman in this world where, we have a lot of violence, these mass shootings are increasing. You see them in schools, you see them in employees shooting their colleagues, you see churches. What are your thoughts on that? How do you feel? How does that change your daily life, or does it? What are your friends saying about these kind of things?
It's tough. We talked about a lot about social media in the last episode and how it can be really overwhelming and everything that you see. Everyone is blaming something else because of these things. A lot of people want to blame it on mental health issues. People want to blame it on gun reform. It's just a lot of pointing fingers at different things. And for me, as a young woman in this country, I just don't know exactly where to find the answers to fix something like the things that are happening right now. And I don't think that there's a clear answer. And I think that's the problem, is we're getting stuck. And I was telling you before we started recording, I went to school to be a teacher, and I went through 3 years of that degree, started my student teaching process, and then the Parkland shooting happened a few years back. I don't know what it was about that particular incident, but it really just, something in me said, don't go through with being a teacher. Find something else. It incited fear in me that, I still would have loved to be a teacher, but it scared me so much that I'm scared to go anywhere. I'm scared to do anything. And I, as a person who struggles with just general anxiety about things that, this is something that causes anxiety, and rightfully so. For me, I'm just scared, to be honest.
Right.
That's
and I think a lot of people are.
The simplest way to put it is I'm just scared. I want answers to fix the problem.
Right.
But it seems like these things happen, and then 3 months go by with nothing happening, and then everyone just kind of moves on and no sort of change happens. So that's probably the most frustrating thing. And it's just, the question of what do we do? How do we fix it?
Right. And certainly we don't have a lot of confidence, unfortunately, in our leaders, because they tend to try to politicize this or turn it into something else as opposed to actually trying to protect children or protect innocent individuals. I mean, it's... the reality is a lot of research has been done around this. The FBI and the Secret Service have done a lot of work. In fact, I have here in front of me a report that just came out January of this year, which is the Secret Service most recent study of about 4 years worth of mass attacks. And this one, they didn't just do people who used a gun. So there were 173 perpetrators in those 4 years, and then they looked at the characteristics of those individuals and what happened. So some of the things we talk about today, I'll mention that. But the reality is nobody's talking about real data. Yeah. Nobody's talking about how do we protect people. They immediately try to politicize it in some way, or people just kind of stick their head. I think you're right to some extent what you said there, and we really kind of become numb to it in a frightening way. Right. The reality is, at the end of the day, these types of things do not happen with anywhere close to the kind of prevalence that they happen in this country anywhere else in the world. Right. There are certainly examples in a lot of different countries of individuals doing these things, but we're talking maybe once or twice in a decade.
Yep.
Whereas, we're sitting here today, and we just a few weeks ago had this horrible shooting in Nashville at this small Christian school, and now, less than 2 weeks later, we have a shooting in a bank in Louisville, Kentucky, and there is a real contagion when it comes to these things. If you look at the data, the likelihood that a second mass shooting will occur within 2 weeks is very high.
Wow.
And Parkland, you mentioned that happened in a very short period of time afterwards. We had Santa Fe.
Yeah.
And so that, there's a role that the media plays in this kind of, I wouldn't say that they kind of celebrate the person, but they certainly celebrate the event to some extent because of the just overwhelming coverage. And if you're a distressed individual out there who feels like they've been wronged, and you're looking to kind of strike back, this is your opportunity to perhaps, make a name for yourself and kind of hurt those that you think have hurt you. And I think the media has a significant role to play in that.
Well, Matt, I have a few questions for you that kind of tie into how mental health is related. I see a lot of times that, certain people will say, this is a mental health issue. It's not a gun issue. It's a mental health issue.
Right.
But then we try to pass laws to get mental health reform in schools and in different places, and then they don't pass. So quite confusing. And I just wanted to share a quote I found from Dr. Ira Glick at Stanford University School of Medicine. This quote is in reference to a study done on the correlation between mental illness and mass shootings. It says, without losing sight of the larger perspective that most who are violent are not mentally ill, and most of the mentally ill are not violent, our message is that mental health providers, lawyers, and the public should be made aware that some unmedicated or untreated patients do pose an increased threat of violence. In your opinion, Matt, what drives a mentally ill person to commit something so heinous like this? And obviously it probably varies from person to person, but
Right.
just in your opinion.
Yeah, and it's a difficult thing, as the quote says, to really talk about this, because the reality is the vast majority of there's 58 million individuals in the United States with a mental illness. The vast majority never commit any kind of violent act. In fact, they're actually more likely, on average, to be the victims
Right.
of violence, because they're more likely to be taken advantage of. But there are a subset. In this report that I just mentioned from the Secret Service, in these 173 individuals that were involved in a mass attack, 58% of them had a mental health problem at the time of their, of this attack that they perpetrated. And obviously, in most instances, it was not being effectively managed. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
And the two most common mental health problems here were depression and a psychosis. And really, if you just look at those two alone, what you have is in psychosis is the easiest to understand.
Yeah.
Because, this is an individual who is delusional, a person who may be hallucinating. So they've lost connection with reality. And so they may have, delusions of, persecution. They feel that people are going to harm them. Or, I've treated clients that had, injured or killed other people because they believed that person was going to harm them. So if you believed that, there's some government conspiracy to harm you or something, or you have to strike out and try to stop that, or make some kind of a message to them.
Right.
That's a little more easy, I think, for people to understand. But that was a much smaller subset of the more of them had depression. And I think what we're seeing, it's not that these things didn't exist in the past. I mean, a lot of times the first, what's thought of as the first mass shooting occurred in 1966. That was the year I was born, and there were even ones before that. And certainly if you think about it in a broader sense and you don't include just shootings, you include bombings or, arson or things like that. And they've gone back, for a long time. Yeah. The reality of what we're seeing is a dramatic increase in the prevalence. What I would suggest is that because we're seeing so many of these individuals who have depression, who are striking out, these are individuals that in the past would have committed suicide. And in a sense, they are committing suicide. This is a suicidal act.
Yeah.
The most of these individuals, it's the death by cop kind of thing. And
Right.
so, what they're doing is they have adopted, or they believe, or they've internalized some conspiracy theory, extremist kind of hate ideology or something, where they're blaming somebody else for the distress that they're having. And you see that, for instance, in this young individual who just harmed these children at the school in Nashville. Nashville, she's striking out at them. And when you see them striking out at schools or at churches, then they're trying to strike out at the most innocent to have the biggest impact, but with the thought that they will also die in the event. And in the past, before we had things like social media or 24-hour news things and stuff like that, where people are constantly exposed to all kind of garbage, and they can be radicalized or be connected to these groups that have hate ideology or conspiracy theories. These individuals would focus their aggression on themselves, and they would die by suicide in an attempt to stop their pain.
Yeah.
But now they're able to focus that out. And I think, and again, where I mentioned earlier, I think the media plays a role in that, because the media kind of celebrates these events, not necessarily by saying they're a good thing, but by the amount of coverage that you see. And then that person sees that and thinks, well, this is my opportunity. And as we just said, these things occur in kind of clusters. And so I think that's why we're seeing a prevalence here. And so what you're getting is a person who in the past may have chosen to move down the route of suicide, alone, isolated. They now strike out because they see that their distress and their problems they believe they're being caused by some external group or society around them, and they want to strike out and do that. Whereas with this psychotic disordered individual, it's a break with reality.
Right.
They don't, what they're doing, they believe to be the right thing to do, perhaps, in that situation. But in both of these instances, lack of mental health care is one aspect of the problem, but it is a complex problem that includes access to weapons or I should say access to highly lethal weapons, the media, bad mental health care system, the breakdown of connections within our society. No one thing is going to make this go away, because no one thing brought it on.
Another thing that I think has a big effect, and we're always arguing, the Constitution, and not just the Second Amendment right to bear arms, but also freedom of speech. Where do we draw the line of freedom of speech when we have these hate groups online that are radicalizing mentally ill individuals who take that? And sure, maybe the words on a screen aren't in themselves violent, but are inciting the violence.
Right. I think the ideas that we have, the rights that we have laid out that we can have in this country are really based on the idea that the individual is in full control or full awareness of their cognitive abilities or reality. And so, if you and I perhaps see some kind of outlandish conspiracy theory online, we may be able to kind of tease that apart. Add to that, if we just find ourselves in distress for whatever reason that may be, we're economically disadvantaged, we lost a job, we're having relational problems, that may make it more difficult for us to separate real conspiracy or conspiracy from reality. Then add to that perhaps mental illness or things like that. So we're not all at the same level or ability to be able to differentiate these things from moment to moment.
Yeah.
And now when you're just, and it's more than just, you can always have picked up a tabloid newspaper or magazine and read some wacky, aliens land on the White House lawn kind of thing. But now you can't get away from it. I mean, we're both sitting here, at this table doing this podcast. We both have our phones in front of us. And so every, extremist idea, every conspiracy theory that's out there presently is literally accessible to us through those phones at this moment. And we can just be absolutely overwhelmed by that. And then, you get into something like what they call doom scrolling, where you're just constantly scrolling through negative things. That impacts your mental health. And we have to stop thinking that everybody that social media is impacting is all at the same level of mental health. We're not. From moment to moment, we're not.
Right.
And so if somebody's already in distress and struggling, that might be all that's necessary to push them over the edge. And then again, you add to that, access to high impact type of weapons. You add to that, all kinds of different things, and you have a very deadly cocktail.
Based on what I've seen personally in online discourse on social media, like we were talking about, many people argue that untreated mental illness is the reason that these terrible horrible events keep taking place in schools specifically. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but, you know, we've settled on the conclusion that it's a myriad of different things. It's not just one thing, but clearly mental health is a part of it. If that's true, then why isn't there funded legislative requirement for mental health, trauma, substance abuse? Why isn't there that type of education in schools? And I know here at HHCI, that's why Gateway to Hope Schools was created, to kind of fill that unfunded need in schools, but we can't take over the world with that. Right. I personally think that we do need funded legislative for that, but why haven't we yet? Why aren't we there?
I mean, again, I think the problem is that we simply aren't willing to have a reasonable conversation about this. You know, those who are the change makers that have the control and ability to do it, we've lost our ability to have political discourse and discussion. And it's disturbing. You're absolutely right. We need more, and schools would be great, but we need more access to mental health care, period. Everyone. In the United States today, a majority of people with mental health problems never receive any treatment at all. Yeah. And so that fact by itself, I mean, let's just play a hypothetical mind game here for a minute. We've been hearing, at least from one side, well, this is all mental health. And we've been hearing that for decades now. Right. Okay. Well, nothing's changed. I mean, and we've had a 37% increase in suicide rates in the last 2 decades. We have mental health numbers right now that are so bad, we've never seen anything like it. Yet less than 50% of individuals with mental health problems have ever received any treatment, no matter how much money we've spent. And so we're not doing a good job on that front. So it's disturbing. I mean, a lot of state legislatures have mandated that teachers and administrators in schools be trained on how to recognize mental health problems. And that's where we've been involved. But, part of the problem there is if you train people how to recognize mental health care problems and they don't have anywhere to send the children. Right. Another component of this is the kind of the breakdown of the family, family dysfunction, family conflict, economic issues. I mean, for every 1% increase in the unemployment rate, you see a 1.6% increase in the suicide rate. Wow. So, I mean, all of this stuff is so interconnected. Yeah. But, we don't, we're not focusing on, say, limiting or minimizing stress and distress in individuals. And certainly, we are not, at least from my opinion, we are not teaching our children to be resilient or to deal with stress. They don't know how to deal with stress. They just fall apart. And anybody that grows up that way, when they're hit with the stressors of life as they become adults, that just causes more and more problems. So I think it's, would be a great idea to have more mental health care in schools, but I think more mental health care almost anywhere would make an impact. I think that these tend to be younger individuals that are doing these things, and so we need to recognize that we've got a serious mental health crisis in this country. If the mass shootings went away tomorrow and there were no more mass shootings, we'd still have a mental health crisis in this country. Definitely. And so, I think that seems to me to be an easy and obvious place that maybe both sides of the political aisle would be interested in saying, this is somewhere we can all help out. But again, in my personal opinion, I hear a lot more argument on people trying to keep their power than I hear people worried about trying to keep kids in school from getting shot.
What's more important?
Yeah, and that's on both sides of the aisle. Definitely. I mean, find myself to be a particularly kind of non-political person. I'm just about trying to help people in distress. And, if we can't sit down and say, let's come up with a reasonable plan where we can do some things we agree on, anything.
Start with one of the things that we're talking about.
To try to reduce some of these things. And certainly affluent country, highly developed Western country, a majority of people with mental health problems should have access to mental health care.
Matt, I feel like a lot of times, I say violent people, but people who would commit something like this, they tend to show concerning signs before they go and do something drastic like this, shoot up a school, shoot up their workplace, whether it's posting ominous messages on social media, isolating themselves from others. In your opinion, what are some signs people should look out for in individuals that they think could pose a violent threat to others?
Well, I think that first off, we don't have to wonder. I mean, these reports are done, these studies have been done, and even this study that I have right here from the Secret Service, almost 50% of the individuals in this study did have some kind of change, be that a personality or behavioral change. Now, that's the difficult thing, is that change kind of varied, but there was a change. And a lot of these people also expressed their concerns or issues with others. And so, one of the things I would say, if you're just looking for, if you want to kind of go with the big numbers out of reports like this, anyone who holds kind of extremist views or to conspiracy theories. And again, let's not get into trying to decide, things that people might consider a gray area.
Right.
I'm talking extremist kind of, the Illuminati is, controlling the world kind of a thing. Or they hold a racist ideology towards certain groups, because a lot of these mass shootings are racially motivated. They happen in synagogues, African-American churches, Asian churches, things like that. And so there's a lot of that, as many as a third of these shootings are generated that way. And so anyone who holds an extremist view like that, then you find the person that they themselves are in distress. They're struggling economically. They're struggling academically. They're not able to move forward in life. And again, add on to that some mental health issues that they're not able or have been unwilling to get treated effectively. And, now you really start to see a kind of a dangerous cocktail. Add to that easy access to deadly weapons, and so they had, this person in Nashville, she had multiple firearms that she'd purchased legally.
Right.
And you mentioned earlier about, kind of gun reform, or you hear a lot of times things like try to keep the guns out of these people's hands. There are laws on the books that, people with certain mental health problems aren't allowed to purchase weapons and stuff like that.
Like you said, most people go untreated, undiagnosed.
Right.
So,
and so that, those are kind of meaningless. If you don't, a law that you put in place that can't be policed is meaningless. Totally. And so, we've got to think about that. And so, you're looking at kind of a multiplicity of different factors here. But those, what I would say is this: if you see someone in distress, whether you think they might shoot up a school or not, we should assist them. You should help them get to care. Yeah. The best thing we can do to prevent these things in the future as individuals is to make sure that we have solid relationships with one another in our circles, that we're talking with one another through problems, that we are learning good coping skills with stress and things like that, so that when the tough times come, we're able to kind of weather those tough times. Every one of these individuals did this in a particularly difficult time. There was like a kind of a triggering event, like a death of a family member, loss of a job, academic issue, things like that. These didn't just happen in a vacuum. You don't just wake up on Thursday morning, everything's great, and you decide to go shoot up a church.
Right.
I think that we have become extremely disconnected as a society. We are isolated from one another. Social media has made that way worse. We now, we're desperately searching for identity and connection. And when when you're in distress and you're having a lot of problems, and you find a group that's willing to draw you in,
no matter what they believe in.
Right. Yeah. It becomes dangerous when you then are kind of learning that the thing to do is to look at this other group and say it's their fault for all your problems. Yeah. Because if you aren't fully aware of your behavior, you may act out. But again, in this study right here by Secret Service, 58% of these individuals had a mental health problem. There's a lot of people there that don't have a mental health problem.
Right.
So it isn't just what I would say is there has never been a mass shooting in which the individual is not distressed.
Of course.
So we have to kind of move away, I think, from the idea of mental illness or mental disorders. These people are all psychologically distressed, and they're unable to cope with that. Whether they meet criteria for a mental illness or not is really kind of meaningless. Yeah. And they have no outlet to try to deal with that for some reason, whatever that may be. Right. And I think to some extent, because of the way We cover this in the media because of the way we've become numb to it in our society, and because of the exposure people have on social media to violence and conflict and things like that. I think that basically what we're doing is we are generating these individuals. So the individuals that are going to commit the next acts are right now being kind of primed by all of these things, fed. That's a great word. And they are, and every time an event occurs like this, a horrific event like this occurs, it moves them one step closer to the next act.
Yeah.
Let's get to a point where we talk about our problems with one another, where we help one another get to care.
Yeah.
Again, this is a great opportunity for the church to provide supportive services, to connect with the mental health community, to be a place where we're helping families, not only learn how to be in quality relationships with one another, but helping them, deal with economic tidal waves, like pandemics and things like that. I mean, helping one another deal with the stressors of life. So we're living in community together, so that there are people out there that are isolated and alone. It's easy to stand back and just start barking off a level. It's this problem, it's that problem, and you need to do that, and let's get rid of all the guns and more mental health care and all that. But the reality is that every day we interact with people, and those people may be hurting. We need to have relationships that are real and transparent, and we need to share our own junk so that they'll share their junk. And that's the way that we change the culture. Now, again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't enact certain regulations and laws and new systems. I think we need to do that because we're just going to have more and more of these.
Definitely.
But I do think that we've got to start on a personal level, and we have to say, well, I'm going to make sure that all of my friends feel comfortable having a conversation with me if they're in distress. And frankly, if everyone did that, I think we'd see a big change.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone, for listening. As always, I'm going to put Hope and Healing Center resources in the show notes. Coming up soon, Matt and I will be recording some more Q&A episodes. Any kind of question you have that you want me and Matt to talk about, it could be on violence like we're talking about right now, or it could be something extremely personal. You could send those to me at contact@hhci.org, and you might just hear me and Matt talk about your question. Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Emilee.